For my daughter's 5th birthday, my wealthy in-laws sent her a cute brown teddy bear as a gift. She looked happy at first, but then she froze and asked Mommy what is wrong with its leg. I looked closer at the toy and went pale. I did not shout. I did not cry. Instead, I took a scalpel from my hidden kit. 3 days later, police were banging on their mansion door, and my mother-in-law was screaming my name in handcuffs. Before I tell you how a stuffed animal took down a criminal empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile at family members who were secretly plotting your destruction. My name is Ebony, and for 7 years, I have played the role of the submissive lucky wife who married into the prestigious Vance family of Chicago. My mother-in-law, Rowena, treats me like a charity case she picked up from the gutter. My husband, Dante, is a man who cannot make a decision without texting his mother first. They think I am just a quiet housewife who spends her days baking cookies and arranging flowers. They have no idea that before I met Dante, I was a senior forensic accountant for a global firm specializing in tracking hidden assets and exposing corporate fraud. I buried that part of my life to build a family, but today they dug it back up. The sun was beating down on our manicured lawn in the upscale suburbs of Chicago. I had spent 3 days preparing for Maya's 5th birthday party. I hung hand-painted garlands and set up a dessert table that looked like something out of a magazine. It was perfect until the roar of an engine shattered the peace. A silver Bentley Bentayga SUV swerved into my driveway, hopping the curb and crushing the bed of purple hydrangeas I had planted with Maya last spring. Out stepped Brad, my sister-in-law Chloe's husband. Brad is white, comes from old money, and has the kind of arrogance that only a lifetime of zero consequences can breed. He slammed the car door and adjusted his $5,000 sunglasses, not even glancing at the flowers he had just destroyed. Rowena stepped out of the passenger side. She was wearing a cream-colored Chanel suit that cost more than my first car. She scanned my backyard with a look of pure disgust, as if she smelled something rotting. She held a glass of champagne in her hand that she had brought from the car. She took a sip, grimaced, and poured the rest onto the grass. She said loud enough for my neighbors to hear that she hoped I did not serve this swill to the guests, because her stomach was sensitive to cheap Prosecco. I forced a smile and welcomed them. Chloe followed them, dragging a massive gift box wrapped in gold foil. Brad walked past me without saying hello. He looked at our house, a modest 4-bedroom colonial that we were proud of, and laughed. He said to Dante that he hoped this postage stamp of a backyard was big enough for the gift they brought. Dante laughed nervously. He always laughs when Brad insults us because Brad is the one who loans him money when his bad investments fail. I watched as they called Maya over. Rowena made a show of pushing the other gifts aside, including the bicycle Dante and I had bought her. She said Grandma brought the only gift that matters. Maya tore open the gold paper. Inside sat a vintage-style brown teddy bear. It looked old. Its fur was matted in places. But what made my heart stop was the right leg of the bear. There was a distinct, jagged burn mark on the fabric, a black scorch that looked like it had survived a fire. Rowena smirked at me. She said she found it at an antique shop and thought it would add some character to our lives. She said she knew how much I connected with damaged goods. I felt the blood drain from my face. That burn mark was identical to the one on the stuffed animal I was holding 26 years ago when the firefighters pulled me out of the apartment fire that killed my parents. Rowena knew that story. She knew it was the single most traumatic event of my life. She had hunted down a replica of my childhood trauma to give to my daughter on her birthday. The glass of lemonade in my hand slipped and shattered on the patio. I stared at the burn mark on the plush leg, and my vision blurred. The smell of smoke filled my nose, a phantom scent from 26 years ago. My hands twitched. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hurl the object over the fence to get that symbol of death away from my innocent child. I gripped the bear's arm, my knuckles turning white. I was ready to launch it into the neighbor's yard. But before I could move, a hand clamped down on my wrist. It was Dante. His grip was clammy and desperate. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale scotch. "Do not do it, Ebony," he hissed into my ear. "Do not embarrass me in front of them. Mom spent hours finding that antique. You will ruin everything if you make a scene." I looked at my husband. His eyes were wide with panic. He was not looking at me with concern. He was looking past me at his mother, terrified of her disapproval. He was protecting the people who were mocking his wife's trauma. The betrayal stung worse than the memory of the fire. Rowena stepped closer, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. She took a sip of her champagne, her eyes dancing with malicious delight. She looked at the scorched leg of the bear, and then at me. "It has a certain rustic charm, do you not think?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "It reminds me of that little apartment you lived in before the accident. You know the one. The fire trap. It must bring back such warm memories of your old home." The cruelty was breathtaking. She was not just referencing the fire, she was reminding me of my place. She was reminding me that I came from nothing, that my parents died with nothing, and that I should be grateful to be allowed in her presence. Brad laughed, a loud barking sound that grated on my nerves. He clapped Dante on the shoulder, nearly knocking him over. "Come on, Rowena, be fair," he said, flashing his veneers. "That bear probably cost $50. That is at least double what her parents' estate was worth when the ashes settled." The air in the backyard seemed to vanish. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was not a passive-aggressive slight. This was an act of war. They were not just being mean. They were trying to break me. They wanted to see the ghetto girl snap. They wanted me to scream and cry so they could point their fingers and say, "Look, she is unstable. She does not belong here." I looked at Maya. She was watching me, her big brown eyes filled with confusion. She did not understand the subtext. She just saw her mommy holding a teddy bear and looking like she was in pain. I could not let them win. I could not let them see me bleed. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the crushed hydrangeas under Brad's tires. I forced the red haze of anger back into a small cold box in my mind. I locked it tight. The heat in my face receded, replaced by an icy calm that I had not felt since my days interrogating embezzlers. I loosened my grip on the bear. I smoothed down its matted fur. I turned to Rowena and Brad and I smiled. It was not a warm smile, it was a shark smile. It was the smile of someone who has just noted a discrepancy in the ledger. "Thank you so much, Rowena," I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "It is incredibly thoughtful of you to remember my history in such vivid detail. Most people would shy away from such tragedy, but you faced it head-on. That takes a special kind of character." Rowena's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She had expected tears. She had expected a fight. She did not know what to do with gratitude that felt like a threat. I turned to Maya. "Come on, baby girl," I said, keeping my voice light. "Let us go put Mr. Bear in your room. He looks tired. He needs a special place on the shelf where he can see everything." I walked toward the house, my back straight, my head held high. I felt their eyes boring into my spine. I knew they were disappointed, but they had no idea. I was not retreating. I was just moving the evidence to a secure location. As I stepped into the cool shadow of the house, my smile vanished. The war had begun. The house finally settled into a heavy silence around 2 in the morning. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of Dante's breathing beside me. It was a wet, heavy snore fueled by the expensive scotch Brad had poured down his throat all afternoon. He was out cold, a dead weight. I slid out from under the duvet, moving with the silent grace of a ghost. I did not need to turn on the lights in the hallway. I knew every creak of the floorboards in this house. I made my way to Maya's room first. She was sleeping soundly, clutching her old raggedy blanket. The new bear sat on the high shelf where I had placed it, staring down at her with its dead plastic eyes. I reached up and took it down. It felt heavier than it should have, a density that cotton and polyester could not explain. I carried it to the kitchen and placed it on the island. I did not turn on the main lights. I clicked on the under cabinet LEDs, bathing the counter in a clinical white glow. I went to the pantry. Behind the rows of organic pasta and gourmet sauces, there was a false back panel I had installed 3 years ago. I pressed the hidden latch and it popped open, revealing a small steel case. This was not a jewelry box. It was my field kit from my former life. I entered the combination and the lid hissed open. Inside lay my tools: lockpicks, a high-frequency radio scanner, and a set of surgical scalpels. I pulled on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. I picked up the number 4 scalpel. The weight of it felt familiar and grounding in my hand. It had been 7 years since I held one, but the muscle memory was instant. I was not Ebony the housewife anymore. I was the auditor. I turned the bear over, exposing the back of its neck. I ran my thumb along the seam. The stitching was subtle, but my eyes saw the difference. The factory thread was machine perfect. This section was hand-sewn. High-quality work, but human. Someone had opened this bear recently and closed it back up. I brought the blade down. I did not hack or tear. I slid the scalpel between the threads, severing them one by one with microscopic precision. I opened a 3-inch incision. I reached inside past the layers of white synthetic fluff. My fingers brushed against something hard and cold. I carefully extracted a rectangular object wrapped in acoustic foam. I peeled back the foam. It was a black matte box, no larger than a matchbook, wired to a flat, high-density battery pack. I recognized the tech immediately. This was not something you buy at an electronics store. This was a VX90 listening device with an integrated cellular transmitter and military-grade GPS. It was the kind of hardware used in corporate espionage. The tiny red status light pulsed once every 10 seconds. It was live. It was transmitting. Rowena and Brad were not just being cruel in-laws. They were running an active surveillance operation in my home. A cold fury settled in my chest, replacing the shock. They were listening to everything. Every conversation, every cry, every private moment. They were building a dossier. They wanted to catch me slipping. They wanted ammunition to take Maya away. I looked at the device in my gloved hand. My first instinct was to crush it under my heel to destroy the violation. But that is what a victim would do. An amateur would destroy the bug and alert the enemy. A professional turns the bug into a weapon. I carefully rewrapped the device in the foam. I nestled it back deep into the center of the bear, ensuring the microphone port was unobstructed. I packed the stuffing back in, smoothing out the lumps. I threaded a needle with brown cotton that matched the fur perfectly. I stitched the incision closed, replicating the tension and pattern of the original seam. When I was finished, there was no trace of the surgery. The bear looked exactly as it had when Rowena smirked and handed it to my daughter. I carried it back to Maya's room and placed it on the shelf, angled precisely towards the center of the room. I leaned in close to its button ear. I lowered my voice to a whisper barely audible, but clear enough for the microphone to catch. "You want to play spy games, Rowena? Fine, let us play." The morning sun hit the granite island in my kitchen, but I felt no warmth. I was already deep in character. I had spent the last hour meticulously staging the scene. I wore my oldest sweatpants and a stained t-shirt. I had purposely tangled my hair and used a touch of gray eyeshadow to create deep hollows under my eyes. I needed to look like a woman who had not slept in weeks. I went into Maya's room and grabbed the bear from the shelf. She was still asleep, so I carried it into the kitchen and propped it up against the fruit bowl. I turned its head slightly, so the microphone inside its plastic ear had a direct line of sight to where I would be standing. I wanted Rowena to have a front row seat to my destruction. I picked up my phone and dialed Tiana. Tiana was my former partner at the agency. She knew the drill. When she answered, I did not say hello. I let out a sob, a loud, jagged sound that ripped from my throat. I started pacing the kitchen floor, my footsteps heavy and erratic. I made sure to knock over a chair so it clattered loudly against the tile. I screamed into the phone. I told Tiana that I could not take it anymore. I wove a tapestry of lies designed specifically to trigger Rowena's greed and judgment. I shouted that Dante had gambled away our savings. I said the bank called this morning and they are going to foreclose on the house. I threw a ceramic mug into the sink. It shattered with a violent crash. I dropped my voice to a frantic whisper, leaning in close to the bear. I said, Tiana, I am losing my mind. I feel like the walls are closing in. I do not think I can be a mother right now. I look at Maya, and I just want to run away. I feel like driving my car off the bridge on the interstate. I feel like ending it all. I paused to let that sink in. I knew Rowena was listening. I knew she was probably recording this right now, grinning as she visualized the custody hearing. I was handing her the silver bullet she needed to prove I was mentally unstable and unfit. I was giving her exactly what she wanted. I hyperventilated for another minute, making sounds of pure distress, before hanging up the phone and throwing it onto the counter. I stood there in the silence, my chest heaving. My heart was racing, but my mind was ice cold. I wiped the fake tears from my cheeks. Then I heard footsteps. Dante shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his face. He looked hungover and confused. He saw the overturned chair. He saw the broken mug in the sink. He looked at me with his bloodshot eyes and asked what was going on. He asked why I was screaming so early in the morning. I did not answer him. I just stared at him with wide, wild eyes, maintaining the charade. I let the tension build. I let him feel the weight of the chaos I had manufactured. I waited. I knew the reaction time would be fast, but I did not realize just how closely they were monitoring us. Dante's phone was sitting on the counter next to the toaster. Suddenly it began to buzz. It vibrated violently against the stone surface. The screen lit up. It was Rowena. I watched Dante reach for it. His hand was shaking slightly. He swiped to answer and put it to his ear. He opened his mouth to speak, but he never got the chance. I could hear Rowena's voice from 3 feet away. It was shrill and panicked, piercing the quiet of the kitchen. She screamed, Dante, get out of that house right now. Get out and come home immediately. Your wife has finally snapped. She is talking about suicide, Dante. She is talking about financial ruin. She is dangerous. Get over here now before she does something crazy. Dante scrambled out of the house like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. I watched through the kitchen window as he fumbled with his keys, dropped them on the driveway, and nearly tripped over his own feet getting into his sedan. He peeled out of the driveway tires, screeching, heading straight for the safety of his mother's mansion. As soon as his taillights disappeared around the corner, I dropped the act. My posture straightened, the panic vanished from my eyes. I locked the front door and engaged the deadbolt, then I went straight down to the basement. I sat before my command center and typed in the sequence to bring up the GPS tracker I had installed in Dante's car. The little red dot moved frantically across the digital map of Chicago, weaving through traffic, breaking speed limits. He was terrified. Good. Fear makes people predictable. Fear makes them run to their masters. I watched the dot turn into the gated community of Highland Park and pull into the long, winding driveway of the Vance estate. I switched screens. I brought up the live feed from the library camera I had hacked into yesterday. The image was crisp and high definition. Rowena was already there, pacing back and forth on her Persian rug, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in her hand. Brad was leaning against the fireplace mantel, looking bored and dangerous. Chloe was curled up in a wingback chair, scrolling on her phone. Dante burst into the room a moment later. He was sweating. He was breathless. He started babbling immediately. He told them I was insane. He told them I was screaming about suicide and foreclosure. He said I was a ticking time bomb. Rowena walked over to him and slapped him across the face. It was a sharp, vicious sound that the microphone picked up clearly. She told him to pull himself together. She said this was the best news they had heard all year. Brad laughed. He walked over to the desk and poured himself a drink. He looked at Dante with pure contempt. He said that my breakdown was the final piece of the puzzle. He said the timeline was moving up. He told Rowena to call their lawyer, passing him the phone. He said they would file an emergency ex parte motion for full custody of Maya on Tuesday morning. He said they would cite immediate danger to the child due to maternal psychosis. Rowena smiled. It was a cold reptilian expression. She said she had been waiting for this day since Dante brought me home. She said she always knew I was weak. She said once they had Maya, they would put me in a state facility and throw away the key. Dante looked down at his shoes, rubbing his stinging cheek. He asked what would happen to me. Rowena scoffed. She said it did not matter what happened to me. She said I was just an incubator that had served its purpose. Brad interrupted. He held up a hand. He said that a mental breakdown was good, but it was not enough to guarantee a permanent win. He said judges can be soft. He said they needed something tangible. He said they needed proof that I was not just sad, but dangerous. He said they needed evidence of neglect or physical abuse. The room went silent. Brad turned his gaze toward the wingback chair. He looked at his wife. He looked at Chloe. Chloe looked up from her phone, bored but listening. Brad smiled. He told her that she had a job to do. He asked her if she remembered the plan they discussed last week. He asked her if she was ready to get her hands dirty for the family. Chloe smirked. She stood up and smoothed her skirt. She looked directly at Dante and then at her husband. She said she knew exactly what to do. She said she would go over to my house this afternoon to check on me. She said by the time she left, she would have a recording of Maya screaming in pain, and it would look like I was the one who hurt her. The afternoon sun was filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room. I sat on the floor with Maya building a tower of blocks. She was laughing, her small hands carefully placing a red block on top of a blue one. It was a moment of pure innocence, a stark contrast to the darkness that was approaching. I knew Chloe was coming. I had been watching the GPS tracker on her phone since she left the mansion. She was 2 minutes away. I stood up and quickly checked the hidden camera nestled in the bookshelf. It was recording. The audio feed was clear. I checked the baby monitor I had planted under the sofa. It was active. I was ready. I smoothed my hair and took a deep breath, centering myself. I needed to be calm. I needed to be precise. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, insistent sound. I opened the door to find Chloe standing there, wearing a pair of oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a bottle of expensive red wine. She did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the foyer, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of expensive perfume. She looked around the living room with a sneer, her eyes landing on Maya. Chloe announced that she was here to check on me because Dante was so worried. She said she brought wine because she figured I needed it. She walked into the living room and poured herself a glass, not bothering to ask for a coaster. She sat down on my white sofa and immediately deliberately tipped the glass. Red wine splashed onto the pristine fabric. She laughed, a high, brittle sound. She said, "Oops, but it is cheap fabric anyway, so it does not matter." I smiled tightly and said I was planning to replace it soon anyway. I went into the kitchen to get a cloth. I watched the video feed on my phone as I walked. Chloe waited until I was out of sight. She put down her glass. She leaned forward towards Maya. She called out in a sweet, sing-song voice, asking Maya to come give Auntie Chloe a hug. Maya, sweet and trusting, walked over to her. She held out her favorite doll. Chloe took the doll and tossed it onto the floor. Then, quick as a viper, her hand shot out. She grabbed Maya's small arm and pinched the tender skin on the inside of her elbow, twisting hard. It was a vicious, calculated move designed to inflict maximum pain without leaving a mark immediately. Maya screamed. It was a high, piercing shriek of shock and agony. Chloe immediately started yelling over her. She screamed, "Stop it! Maya, stop hitting me! Why are you so violent? Your mother taught you this, didn't she?" She was staging the audio. She was creating the evidence for the bear in the other room to record. She wanted the recording to sound like an out-of-control child and a negligent mother. I did not run in screaming. I did not give her the reaction she wanted. I walked back into the room with a calm, measured stride. I scooped Maya up into my arms, holding her close. I looked Chloe dead in the eye. I spoke clearly and loudly, projecting my voice towards the hallway where the bear was listening. I said, "Oh my goodness, Chloe, you are so clumsy. Did you trip and fall on Maya? You must be drunk. I smell the wine on you. You should not be around children when you are intoxicated. I see the red mark on her arm where you grabbed her to steady yourself. We need to put some ice on that. Why are you shaking, Chloe? Are you going through withdrawal?" Chloe froze. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. This was not the script. She tried to stammer a denial, but I kept talking calm and reasonable, painting a picture of a drunk aunt hurting a child by accident. I narrated her confusion. I asked if she needed me to call a cab. I turned the tables completely. The recording would not show an abusive mother. It would show a protective mother shielding her child from an intoxicated relative. Chloe grabbed her purse and fled the house without another word. She knew she had lost this round. The house finally settled into a heavy silence around 2 in the morning. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of Dante's breathing beside me. It was a wet, heavy snore, fueled by the expensive scotch Brad had poured down his throat all afternoon. He was out cold, a dead weight. I slid out from under the duvet, moving with the silent grace of a ghost. I did not need to turn on the lights in the hallway. I knew every creak of the floorboards in this house. I made my way to Maya's room first. She was sleeping soundly, clutching her old raggedy blanket. I kissed her forehead and silently promised that no one would ever hurt her again. Then I went straight down to the basement. This was my sanctuary, my war room. I walked to the back corner where we stored the old holiday decorations. I pushed aside a stack of plastic bins and pried up a loose floorboard that I had loosened years ago. Underneath lay a waterproof pelican case. I popped the latches and lifted the lid. Inside sat my customized, ruggedized laptop. It had not touched the internet in 3 years, but tonight I needed to go online. I needed to go hunting. I sat at my old drafting table and booted up the machine. The screen glowed with a harsh blue light illuminating my face in the darkness. I did not use the home Wi-Fi. I plugged in a cellular modem with a spoofed SIM card that routed my signal through servers in Estonia and Singapore. I cracked my knuckles and began to type. My target was Brad Tucker. I knew he was arrogant. Arrogant men always make mistakes. They think their wealth is a shield. They think their passwords are secure because they pay expensive consultants to set them up. But Brad was lazy. I started with the public-facing servers of his charity foundation, the Black Excellence Initiative. I probed the firewall looking for a weakness. It was standard corporate security, strong enough to keep out a teenager, but not strong enough to stop a senior forensic auditor who knows exactly where to look. I ran a brute force script against the admin portal using a dictionary of passwords Brad had used on his social media accounts years ago. He was predictable. He reused the same variations of his college football jersey number and his first dog's name. It took less than 10 minutes. The screen flickered. A green prompt appeared in the center of the black terminal window. Access granted. I was in. I bypassed the user interface and went straight for the raw data. I accessed the financial ledgers. I started pulling tax returns, bank statements, and internal memos. What I saw made my stomach turn. On the surface, the charity looked like a beacon of hope for underprivileged youth. But the numbers told a different story. It was a classic layering scheme. Millions of dollars were flowing in from anonymous donors in the Cayman Islands. That money was then being funneled out to shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada for consulting fees and construction costs that never existed. I traced the ownership of the shell companies. They all led back to a holding company owned by Rowena Vance. They were washing dirty money through a charity meant to help Black children. It was despicable. But then I found the smoking gun. I opened a folder labeled Q4 Compliance. There, on the bottom of every single fraudulent financial report, was a signature. It was not Brad's. It was not Rowena's. It was Dante's. My husband was listed as the chief financial officer of the shell company that was absorbing all the liability. I stared at the screen. The betrayal was absolute. They were not just using him, they were setting him up. If the feds ever looked into this, Brad and Rowena would be clean. They would claim ignorance. They would point the finger at the CFO who signed off on every illegal transaction. Dante was going to prison for 20 years for crimes he did not even understand. He was not a partner in their empire. He was the sacrificial lamb. I sat in the cold glow of my monitor and watched the digital trail of corruption unfold before my eyes. The Black Excellence Initiative was not a charity. It was a vacuum. I pulled up the donation logs. On the surface, everything looked legitimate. There were large contributions from anonymous donors and corporate matching programs. But when I cross-referenced the outflows, the picture became dark. The money was not going to scholarships or community centers. It was being bled out in thousands of small transactions labeled as administrative costs and consulting fees. I ran a trace on the receiving accounts. They were bouncing through servers in Estonia and Cyprus before landing in the Cayman Islands. It was a sophisticated layering scheme designed to wash the money clean before it hit the offshore vaults. I needed to know who held the keys to those vaults. I dug into the corporate registry data, peeling back the layers of obfuscation. I found 3 primary entities receiving the bulk of the funds: Apex Consulting, Blue Horizon Logistics, and Vance Global. I pulled the incorporation papers for Vance Global. The registered agent was a lawyer in Panama, but the beneficial owner was listed in the fine print of a secondary attachment: Rowena Vance. My mother-in-law was not just a socialite spending her late husband's money. She was an active participant in a massive embezzlement ring. She was stealing millions of dollars meant for underprivileged children and using it to fund her Chanel suits and country club memberships. I looked at the transaction dates. The transfers coincided perfectly with her lavish vacations and home renovations. Every time she posted a photo of a new diamond necklace on Instagram, there was a corresponding withdrawal from the charity fund. It was sickening. She was a parasite feeding on the goodwill of others, and Brad was her enforcer, using his family connections to legitimize the fraud. But I needed to know how deep Dante was in this. Was he just a signature on a page, or was he benefiting from the theft? I accessed his personal bank records. I had always handled our household finances, but Dante had insisted on keeping a separate account for his business expenses. I cracked the password in seconds. It was his birthday. I scrolled through the ledger expecting to see transfers from the charity. I expected to see payoffs. Instead, I saw withdrawals, massive hemorrhaging withdrawals. He was not getting rich. He was bleeding dry. And then I saw it. A wire transfer dated 3 weeks ago, $50,000. It was a huge sum money we definitely did not have. It had emptied his 401k. I looked at the recipient. It was not a shell company. It was not a bank. It was an individual. The name on the account was Jasmine Starr. I ran a quick background check on the name. It linked to a social media profile filled with photos of a 22-year-old woman in expensive lingerie posing on boats and in hotel rooms. The room spun. Dante was not just a fool being used by his mother. He was a cheater. He had drained our retirement savings not to save the family business, but to pay off a sugar baby. I stared at the screen, feeling the bile rise in my throat. He was paying for affection while I was clipping coupons to save for Maya's college fund. He was destroying our future for a few hours of attention. And suddenly the pieces clicked into place. Brad and Rowena knew. They were not just using Dante's ignorance, they were using his guilt. They had leverage on him. They were letting him play CEO because they owned him completely. I stared at the name Jasmine Starr on my screen. The woman who had received $50,000 of my family's future. My forensic instincts overrode my heartbreak. In my line of work, there are no coincidences. A man like Dante, who pinches pennies on grocery bills and asks his mother for permission to buy new tires, does not suddenly find the courage to cultivate a high-end mistress on his own. He was led there. I opened a new search window. I ran Jasmine's social security number through a database of known associates linked to the Vance family businesses. Nothing came up immediately. Then I checked her bank deposits. I traced the routing numbers. Aside from the transfers from Dante, she was receiving a monthly stipend of $5,000 from a company called Apex Consulting. I froze. Apex Consulting was one of the shell companies I had just identified in the money laundering scheme. The company was registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, but the signatory was Bradley Tucker. The picture snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. Jasmine was not a random affair, she was an employee. Brad had hired her. He had placed her in Dante's path, probably at one of those charity galas where the champagne flows too freely. He had manufactured the affair. He had curated the temptation. I hacked into Dante's cloud storage, looking for the correspondence I knew had to be there. I found a hidden folder labeled Legal. Inside, there were no legal documents. There were photos. Compromising photos of Dante and Jasmine in a hotel room. And there were emails from Brad. The subject lines were innocuous things like meeting minutes or golf schedule, but the content was pure venom. One email read, "Dante, these photos are very vivid. It would be a shame if they ended up in Ebony's inbox. Or worse, if the morality clause in your mother's trust fund was triggered. Just sign the quarterly reports for the foundation as CFO, and we can keep this our little secret." Dante had not just been reckless. He had been hunted. Brad had baited the trap with Jasmine, waited for Dante to take the bite, and then slammed the cage door shut. The $50,000 Dante sent her was likely hush money, a desperate attempt to buy her silence before Brad tightened the screws. But you cannot buy silence from someone who is already bought and paid for by your enemy. Dante had signed those fraudulent financial reports not out of ambition, but out of terror. He had sold his soul and his freedom to hide his infidelity. I closed the laptop. The hum of the cooling fan sounded like a jet engine in the quiet basement. I walked up the stairs, my legs feeling heavy as lead. I pushed open the door to our bedroom. The room smelled of lavender and the stale alcohol seeping from Dante's pores. He was sprawled on his back, mouth open, one arm hanging off the side of the bed. He looked pathetic. He looked like a child who had broken a vase and was pretending to be asleep so he wouldn't get in trouble. I stood over him, watching his chest rise and fall. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. He had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. He had touched another woman. He had given away our savings. But beneath the disgust, there was a cold, pitying realization. He was not a villain. He was a fool. He was a weak, spineless man who had allowed himself to be maneuvered into a corner by wolves. He thought he was saving himself, but he was just digging his own grave. I looked at his sleeping face and realized I did not hate him. You have to respect someone to hate them. I just felt a profound, hollow disappointment. He was the anchor dragging me down, and I knew exactly when I would have to cut the rope. My phone buzzed just before noon with a text message from Brad. It was not a request. It was a summons. He told me to meet him at the Capitol Grill in 45 minutes. He said we needed to discuss the future. I knew exactly what this was. It was the pincer maneuver. Rowena applied the pressure at home, and Brad applied the pressure with the wallet. I put on my best dress, the one I usually saved for church, and drove downtown. I needed to look presentable but still desperate enough to be bought. I walked into the restaurant. The air smelled of aged steaks and old money. Brad was sitting in a corner booth nursing a glass of scotch. He did not stand up when I approached. He gestured for me to sit. He looked me up and down with that familiar sneer he reserved for the help. He told the waiter to bring me an iced tea because he assumed I would not be drinking on a budget. He was right about the budget, but wrong about the reason. I needed a clear head to watch him dig his own grave. Brad leaned forward, resting his elbows on the white tablecloth. He started talking about Dante. He called my husband a disappointment. He said Dante was weak and drowning in debt and dragging me down with him. He said he felt sorry for me. He said he knew I came from a difficult background and that marrying into the Vance family must have been overwhelming for someone of my station. It was a masterclass in condescension. He was trying to frame himself as my savior. He reached under the table and pulled out a sleek metal briefcase. He placed it on the table between us. It landed with a heavy, solid thud. He clicked the latches open just enough for me to see inside. It was filled with stacks of $100 bills. Fresh, crisp bands of cash. He lowered his voice. He said there is $100,000 in there, Ebony. It is untraceable. It is tax-free. It is enough to start a new life somewhere far away. Maybe go back to school. Maybe open a little bakery. Whatever people like you dream of doing. I looked at the money. It was tempting in a theoretical way, but I knew there was a catch. There is always a catch with men like Brad. I asked him what I had to do. He smiled a shark-like grin that did not reach his eyes. He said it was simple. I just had to sign the divorce papers. And I had to sign a document granting full legal and physical custody of Maya to Rowena. He said Maya belonged with the Vance family. He said they could give her the life she deserved, a life of private schools and debutante balls. He said I could visit her on holidays if I behaved. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was trying to buy my daughter. He thought because I was black and came from poverty that my maternal instinct had a price tag. He thought $100,000 was a fortune to me. He did not know I had seized assets worth 10 times that amount from criminals smarter than him. I reached out and placed my hand on the briefcase. Brad's eyes lit up. He thought he had won. I slowly, firmly pushed the metal case back across the table toward him. It slid across the linen with a soft hiss. I looked him dead in the eye. My voice was low and steady. I told him that I might be broke, Brad. I might be from the gutter, as your mother likes to say. But I do not sell my children. Maya stays with me. Brad's smile vanished instantly. His face turned a mottled shade of red. He snapped the briefcase shut. He leaned in close, his expensive cologne suddenly smelling like rot. He hissed at me. He said that I was making a mistake. He said I was refusing a lifeline. He said if I did not take the money and leave quietly, then they would take Maya anyway. He said they would destroy me in court. He said I would end up on the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. He said that if I chose to fight, I would lose everything. I drove home from the lunch with Brad with my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The threat hung heavy in the air, but I pushed it aside. I had to stay focused. When I walked into my house, the air felt different. Stale. Charged. Rowena and Chloe were sitting at my kitchen table drinking tea from my good china. They had let themselves in again using the unauthorized key Dante had given them. They did not look up when I entered. They just continued their conversation, as if I were a ghost in my own home. I walked into the living room to put down my purse, and I stopped. Something was wrong. The room felt off balance. I looked closer. The heavy oak coffee table had been shifted 4 inches to the left. The family portraits on the mantel had been rearranged. The picture of my parents was gone, replaced by a photo of Dante and Rowena at a gala. I felt a spike of adrenaline. This was not cleaning. This was psychological warfare. They were messing with my environment to make me question my perception. I walked back into the kitchen. I asked them where the picture of my parents was. Rowena looked at me with wide, innocent eyes. She took a sip of tea and said she did not know what I was talking about. She said the mantel had always been arranged that way. She asked if I was feeling all right. She said I looked flushed and feverish. Chloe chimed in. She said maybe I was having one of my episodes again. I decided to play along. I needed the bear in the other room to hear my distress. I needed them to think their plan was working. I pressed my hands to my temples and said I had a splitting headache. I walked to the medicine cabinet to get my migraine prescription. I opened the door. The bottle was gone. It was always on the second shelf next to the rubbing alcohol. I frantically moved the bottles around: toothpaste, bandages, cough syrup, no migraine pills. I turned to them. I asked where my medication was. I tried to sound frantic. I let my voice rise in panic. Rowena tutted softly. She walked over to the refrigerator and opened the door. There, sitting next to the milk jug, was my bottle of pills. She held it up with a pitying smile. She said, "Ebony, you put them in here 10 minutes ago, when you came in the back door. Do you not remember? I stared at her. I had not come in the back door. I had just arrived through the front. I had never put pills in the fridge in my life. But I knew what they wanted. I grabbed the bottle and let my hands shake. I stammered. I said I did not remember doing that. I said I was confused. Chloe laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. She said, "Did you forget again, Ebony? Your memory is terrible lately. It must be the stress of being such a bad wife." I sank onto the floor and buried my face in my hands. I sobbed loudly for the benefit of the microphones. I wailed that I was losing my mind. Rowena patted my head like I was a dog. She whispered that they would take care of Maya when I finally snapped completely. They stayed for another hour, moving my keys while I was in the bathroom and turning the thermostat up to 80 degrees while denying it was hot. When they finally left, they looked triumphant. They thought they had broken me. But the moment the door clicked shut, I stood up. My tears dried instantly. I walked to the refrigerator and took out the pills. I went to the living room and moved the table back 4 inches. I retrieved the photo of my parents from the trash can where they had hidden it. Then I went to the basement. I opened a physical notebook with a black cover. I did not trust digital files for this part. I wrote down the date and time. I documented every item moved. I documented the gaslighting tactics. I wrote down their exact quotes. I was building a timeline of abuse. They were trying to make me crazy, but they were only making me meticulous. It was 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday when my phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Mrs. Gable Maya's kindergarten teacher at the private academy I paid for with my secret consulting fees. I answered on the first ring. Mrs. Gable sounded nervous. Her voice was a hushed whisper. She told me that my mother-in-law was currently in the front office. She said Rowena was demanding to take Maya out of class early for a surprise sleepover at the estate. She said Rowena was claiming that I had been hospitalized for a mental breakdown and was unable to care for the child. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline shoot through my veins. This was it. The escalation I had predicted. They were trying to seize physical custody before the court date to establish a status quo. I told Mrs. Gable to initiate the lockdown protocol we had discussed at the beginning of the school year. I told her to keep the classroom door locked and not to release Maya under any circumstances. I told her I was 5 minutes away. I grabbed my keys and my emergency legal file. I did not speed. I did not drive recklessly. I drove with the precision of a tactical unit responding to a hostage situation. I called the school resource officer on his direct line. I identified myself and stated clearly that there was an unauthorized individual attempting to remove a minor from the premises against a standing directive. When I pulled up to the school entrance, I saw Rowena's massive black Mercedes parked diagonally across the fire lane, blocking the buses. She was standing on the sidewalk screaming at Officer Davis. She was waving her diamond-encrusted hands in the air, her face contorted in a mask of entitlement and rage. She looked like a banshee in Chanel. She was yelling that she was a Vance and that she donated the new library wing so she could take her granddaughter whenever she pleased. I slammed my car door shut and marched toward them. Rowena saw me. Her eyes widened, then narrowed into slits. She pointed a manicured finger at me. She shrieked at the officer. She said, "There she is. That is the unstable woman I told you about. She is dangerous. She is a threat to the child. Arrest her." Officer Davis looked at me. He looked at the calm, composed woman in the sharp blazer, not the hysterical mess Rowena had described. He kept his hand resting lightly on his belt. He told Rowena to lower her voice and step away from the school doors. I did not engage with her insults. I walked straight to Officer Davis. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope. I handed it to him. It was a notarized affidavit of custody and a certified letter from our family attorney stating that Rowena Vance was explicitly forbidden from picking up the child. I had prepared it 3 days ago after hacking their library camera and hearing their plan. Officer Davis read the document. He nodded. He turned to Rowena. He told her that she was trespassing. He told her that she had no legal right to remove the child and that the paperwork in his hand superseded her donation to the library. He told her that if she did not get in her car and leave the premises immediately, he would place her under arrest for attempted kidnapping and disturbing the peace. Rowena turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. She sputtered. She gasped. She tried to play the victim. She said she just wanted to buy Maya ice cream. She said I was a monster keeping a grandmother from her blood. I stepped into her personal space. I looked her dead in the eye. My voice was low and lethal. I told her that if she ever came within 500 feet of my daughter's school again, I would ensure she spent the night in a holding cell with no mirrors. Rowena looked at the officer, then at me. She realized she had no power here. She stomped to her car, got in and peeled away, nearly hitting a crossing guard. I watched her go. I went inside to hug my daughter. Maya asked if Grandma was mad. I told her Grandma was just confused about the rules. But I knew the rules had just changed. This was no longer a Cold War. It was open combat. I sat in the basement watching the live feed from the Vance library. The air in the room on the screen was thick enough to choke on. Brad was not drinking today. He was pacing like a caged tiger. Dante sat in the leather chair looking like a man awaiting execution. Brad stopped pacing and leaned over him. His face was twisted into a mask of pure venom. He told Dante that I had humiliated his mother at the school. He said I had threatened them with legal action. He slammed his hand onto the desk. Brad leaned in close to Dante's ear. I turned up the volume on my headset. Brad hissed that Dante needed to get his house in order. He said that if Dante could not control his wife, then Brad would have no choice but to release the insurance policy. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. He showed Dante a picture. Even on the grainy feed, I knew what it was. It was Dante and Jasmine in the hotel room. Brad said he would send the photos to the church elders, to Dante's boss, and to every news outlet in Chicago. He said he would destroy Dante's reputation so thoroughly he would never work in this city again. Dante turned a sickly shade of gray. He nodded frantically. He promised to fix it. He promised to make me submit. He scrambled out of the room like a whipped dog. I closed the laptop and went upstairs. I knew he was coming. I knew he was terrified. And I knew that a terrified man is a dangerous man. I went to the kitchen and started washing dishes. I made sure the hallway door was open so the bear in Maya's room had a clear audio path. I sent Maya to the backyard to play with her headphones on. I did not want her to hear her father fall apart. 20 minutes later, Dante burst through the front door. He did not say hello. He stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed and sweating. He threw his keys onto the counter with enough force to chip the granite. He started screaming immediately. He yelled that I was ruining his life. He screamed that I had embarrassed his mother and disrespected his family. He parroted Brad's words almost verbatim. He called me ungrateful. He called me out of control. I did not argue back. I did not raise my voice. I stood by the sink drying a plate, my posture calm and submissive. I said quietly that I was just protecting our daughter. That triggered him. He stepped into my personal space. I could smell the fear and aggression coming off him in waves. He shouted that he was the head of this household. He screamed that I would do what I was told. He said I would apologize to Rowena and I would sign whatever papers Brad put in front of me. I looked him in the eye and said, "No, Dante, I will not." That one word broke him. He let out a roar of frustration. He swept his arm across the drying rack. Plates and glasses flew across the room, smashing against the opposite wall. The sound was deafening. Shards of ceramic and glass rained down on the floor. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still amidst the wreckage. I looked at the broken pieces of our wedding china on the floor. I looked at the man I had married, panting and wild-eyed. I knew the bear heard the crash. I knew it heard the threat in his voice. Brad had wanted him to control me, but he had just handed me the evidence of domestic intimidation. I looked at him and thought, "Keep going, Dante. Dig the hole deeper." The diner was located on the south side of Chicago, far away from the manicured lawns and gated communities of Highland Park. It was the kind of place where the coffee was strong, and the patrons minding their own business was a survival skill. I walked in wearing a nondescript hoodie and sunglasses. I scanned the room. Agent Miller was sitting in the back booth facing the door. He looked older than when we worked the Enron case together. His hair was grayer, but his eyes were just as sharp. He tapped his fingers on the laminate table, a nervous habit he never broke. I slid into the booth opposite him. I did not say hello. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive. I placed it on the table and slid it across to him under the cover of a menu. Miller picked it up and pocketed it in one smooth motion. He asked if it was all there. I told him it was everything. The shell companies in Delaware, the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, the invoices for construction equipment that never existed, and the emails from Brad instructing Dante to sign the fraudulent compliance reports. Miller took a sip of his black coffee. He looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. He said that I had done incredible work. He said the forensic accounting was airtight. He said he could build a RICO case on this data alone that would put the Vance family away for decades. I felt a momentary surge of relief. I thought it was over. I thought I could go home and pack my bags. But then Miller leaned in closer, lowering his voice. He said there was a problem. He said that while the financial crimes were clear, they take time to prosecute. He said that white-collar investigations move at a glacial pace. He said that indictments could take months, maybe years, to unseal. I felt the blood drain from my face. I told him I did not have months. I told him they were coming for my daughter next week. I told him about the emergency custody hearing and the manufactured evidence of abuse. Miller nodded grimly. He understood the stakes. He said that to move faster, to get an immediate arrest warrant, an emergency protection order, we needed something visceral. We needed proof of immediate danger or a direct violation of federal surveillance laws. He asked about the bear. I told him it was still in Maya's room recording every sound in the house. He said that was our leverage. The financial fraud was the nail in the coffin, but the wiretapping was the hammer. He said that illegal surveillance of a minor was a federal felony that judges hated. But we had a technical issue. We could prove the device existed, but we needed irrefutable proof that Brad and Rowena were the ones listening on the other end. He said defense lawyers would argue that I planted it myself, or that it was a baby monitor gone wrong. Miller looked me dead in the eye. He said, "Ebony, I need you to get them on tape. I need a direct link. I need Brad or Rowena to admit they are listening. I need them to reference something they could only know from the bear. Or better yet, I need them to confess to planting it. You have to get a confession, Ebony. If you get that, I can have a SWAT team at their door in an hour." The invitation to the Black Excellence Gala was not a request. It was a command. Rowena texted me that morning saying my attendance was mandatory for family unity. She added a postscript that chilled my blood. She said to wear the gray dress she bought me 5 years ago. It was a shapeless, drab thing that made me look like a governess. She wanted me there, but she wanted me invisible. She wanted me to be the gray background against which Chloe could shine. I arrived at the venue, a glittering ballroom in downtown Chicago. Dante met me at the door. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him perfectly, a stark contrast to my outdated attire. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit. He hissed at me to smile and not embarrass him. He said this was a big night for the family. Inside the room was a sea of sequins and tuxedos. Rowena held court in the center, wearing a gold gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. Chloe was beside her in a stunning red dress, laughing loudly at a donor's joke. When they saw me, Rowena's smile didn't falter, but her eyes were cold. She introduced me to a group of investors as Dante's wife who prefers the quiet life. It was a subtle dig, a way to dismiss me before I even spoke. Brad was on stage, the master of ceremonies. He looked charismatic and confident, charming the crowd with jokes about philanthropy and community. He spoke about the future of the foundation, about expanding their reach. Then he announced a leadership change. He said that due to the rapid growth of their initiatives, they needed a dedicated leader to steer the ship. He called Dante up to the stage. Dante walked up the steps looking like a man marching to the gallows. Brad put an arm around him, beaming like a proud brother. He announced to the room that Dante Vance would be taking over as the new CEO of the Black Excellence Initiative, effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. Rowena clapped the loudest, her eyes shining with triumph. A waiter brought a document to the podium. It was ceremonial. Brad said a symbolic signing of the new charter. Dante picked up the pen. I watched from the shadows. I saw his hand shake. I saw him look out at the crowd, searching for something, maybe an escape. But then he looked at Brad. Brad whispered something in his ear, probably a reminder of the photos of the debt, of the ruin that awaited him if he refused. Dante lowered the pen. He signed the document. The camera flashes went off blindingly bright. In that moment, Dante sealed his fate. He had just signed a document accepting full legal responsibility for a shell company laundering millions of dollars. He thought he was getting a promotion. He was actually signing his own arrest warrant. I took a sip of my water, watching the celebration. They were toasting to their success, unaware that they had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to bury them all. I excused myself from the table, needing a moment to breathe away from the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and deceit. The ladies' room at the venue was an oasis of marble and gold leaf, quieter than the roar of the ballroom, but no less ostentatious. I stood at the sink, washing my hands with liquid soap that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I looked at myself in the mirror. The gray dress hung on my frame like a sack, making me look washed out and invisible, just as Rowena intended. The door swung open and Chloe breezed in. She was a vision in crimson silk, holding a glass of champagne she was not supposed to bring in here. She saw me and her lips curled into a sneer. She locked the door behind her, trapping us in the gilded cage. She leaned against the vanity, placing her clutch on the marble counter with a heavy thud. "Well, if it is not the CEO's wife," she drawled, her voice dripping with condensation. "You look like the help, Ebony. Did you get that dress at a thrift store? Or did Mom dig it out of her attic just to humiliate you?" She laughed, taking a sip of her drink. "You really do not belong here, do you? Look at Dante out there. He is finally stepping up. He is finally becoming a Vance. And you are just an anchor dragging him down." I dried my hands slowly. I turned to face her. For 7 years I had taken her insults. I had lowered my head and let her walk all over me because I thought it was the price of admission for a family. But tonight, I was not buying a ticket. I was burning down the theater. I took a step toward her. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not look at the floor. I looked straight into her eyes. My expression was not sad or scared. It was bored. I asked her if she was finished. Chloe blinked, surprised by my tone. She straightened up, trying to regain her dominance. She said, "Watch your mouth, Ebony. You are lucky we even let you come tonight. Once we get custody of Maya, you will be back on the street where you belong." I laughed. It was a low, dark sound that bounced off the tiled walls. I stepped into her personal space, invading her bubble. I saw her eyes widen. She saw something in my face she had never seen before. She saw the predator behind the mask. I told her that she was confused. I told her she thought she was the shark in the tank, but she was just the chum. I leaned in close until I could smell the alcohol on her breath and the fear beginning to radiate off her skin. I reached out and ran a finger along the strap of her handbag sitting on the counter. It was a black Birkin bag, the ultimate symbol of status, or at least it was supposed to be. I lowered my voice to a whisper that cut through the silence like a knife. I said, "You should be careful with that Hermes bag, Chloe. You would not want to scratch it. Especially since the stitching on the handle is a dead giveaway. Real Hermes uses a saddle stitch that is angled. This is a straight machine stitch. I know you bought it from that back alley vendor on Canal Street for $300. I know because I tracked the transaction on your secret credit card, the one you used to hide your gambling debts from Brad." Chloe went rigid. Her face drained of color, leaving her rouge standing out like clown paint. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She grabbed the bag, clutching it to her chest as if to hide the evidence. I smiled at her one last time before unlocking the door. I told her to enjoy the party because everything has a price, and her bill was coming due. I drove home from this gala in silence. The city lights blurred past my window, but my mind was razor sharp. I had the financial records, I had the evidence of the surveillance. But Agent Miller was right. I needed something more immediate. I needed them to commit a crime that required police intervention right now. I needed to dangle the one thing they could not resist: money. I walked into the house. It was quiet. Dante was still at the after party, probably getting drunk to drown out the voice in his head, telling him he had just signed his life away. I went upstairs to Maya's room. She was asleep, her chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. The bear sat on the shelf watching over her like a sentinel of doom. Its plastic eyes glinted in the moonlight. I knew the microphone was live. I knew they were listening, waiting for me to crack. I sat on the edge of the bed. I smoothed Maya's hair. I began to speak. I kept my voice low and trembling. I sounded like a woman at the end of her rope whispering secrets in the dark. I said, "Baby girl, mommy has a secret." I said I never told daddy because I was scared. I said grandma and grandpa did not leave me nothing. I said they left me a key. I paused for effect. I took a shaky breath. I said there is a safety deposit box at the First National Bank downtown. I said there is cash inside, baby. $200,000. My parents saved it their whole life. I said I am going to go there tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I am going to take the money and we are going to run away. We are going to leave daddy and his mean family and we are going to start over. Just you and me. I stood up and kissed Maya's cheek. I walked out of the room and closed the door. I leaned against the wall in the hallway and counted to 3. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of town. In the library of the Vance estate, Rowena and Brad were huddled around the receiver. I could imagine the greed lighting up their eyes. $200,000 was not a fortune to them, but it was liquid cash. And more importantly, it was mine. The thought of me having something they did not possess was unbearable to them. Rowena probably gripped Brad's arm, her nails digging into his suit jacket. She would say, "I knew it. I knew that little rat was holding out on us." She would say that money belongs to the family. Brad would be calculating. He would see this as the perfect opportunity. He would not let me walk into a bank and disappear. He would want that cash. He would want to crush my escape plan. He would say we cannot let her leave with that money. He would say we need to intercept her. He would look at the map. He would know the route from my house to the bank. He would pick the spot. The old industrial district, the shortcut I always took to avoid traffic. He would say, "I will handle this myself." He would say, "I will cut her off at the alley." He would say she will hand over the money and then she will sign the custody papers. He would say tomorrow ends everything. I walked into my bedroom and started to pack a bag, not for running away, but for war. I checked my dash cam. I checked the batteries in my recorder. They took the bait. Now I just had to wait for the trap to snap shut. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of wet slate. I dressed in my sharpest black suit and applied a coat of red lipstick that felt like war paint. I kissed Maya goodbye and told her to be good for the neighbor who was watching her. I got into my sedan and drove toward downtown. I did not take the highway. I took the surface streets, driving through the old industrial district where the warehouses stood empty and the streets were lined with cracked pavement. I checked my rearview mirror. There it was. A black Range Rover sitting 2 car lengths back. Brad was not even trying to be subtle. He wanted me to know he was there. He wanted me to be afraid. He thought fear would make me compliant. He did not know that fear burned out of me years ago, leaving only cold calculation. I turned my blinker on, indicating a left turn down a narrow alleyway behind the defunct textile factory. It was a dead end used only by delivery trucks that no longer came. I turned the wheel and pulled into the shadows. I drove halfway down the alley and hit the brakes. I put the car in park and waited. Seconds later, the Range Rover swerved in behind me, blocking the exit. The nose of his luxury SUV was inches from my bumper. I was trapped. Or at least, that is what he thought. The driver door of the Rover opened. Brad stepped out. He was wearing a cashmere coat and leather driving gloves. In his right hand, he gripped a tire iron. The metal looked out of place against his expensive attire, but the look in his eyes fit perfectly. It was the look of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain. He walked toward my car, his boots crunching on the gravel. He tapped the tire iron against his palm, a rhythmic metallic threat. I unlocked my door and stepped out. The air was freezing, but I did not shiver. I stood my ground. Brad stopped 5 feet away. He smiled, a cruel twisting of his lips. He told me that I was a smart girl for stopping. He said he did not want to damage his car by running me off the road. He held out his hand. He demanded the bag. He said, "Hand over the cash, Ebony, and maybe I will let you walk away from this with just a few bruises." I looked at him. I feigned a tremble in my voice. I told him it was in the trunk. I told him it was everything I had. I begged him not to hurt me. He laughed. He said he would decide what I deserved after he counted the money. He motioned with the tire iron for me to open the trunk. I walked to the back of the sedan. My hands were steady as I pressed the release button. The trunk lid popped open with a mechanical click. Brad stepped forward, eager and greedy, pushing me aside to look inside. He expected stacks of bills. He expected a life-changing payday. Instead, he stared into an empty trunk. There was no bag, there was no money, there was only a small tripod bolted to the floor. Mounted on top was a high-definition camera. The red recording light was blinking steadily, and next to it was a microphone pointed directly at his face. Brad froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and waxen. He looked at the camera. He looked at the tire iron in his hand. He looked at me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had just been recorded threatening a woman with a deadly weapon in a deserted alley. He had just committed armed robbery and assault on tape. He screamed. It was a primal sound of rage and panic. He raised the tire iron high above his head. He lunged at me. He shouted that he was going to kill me. He screamed that he would bury me right here in this alley. He said, "No one makes a fool of a Vance." He swung the iron down. I did not flinch. I did not move. I just watched the camera record his intent to murder. Brad swung the tire iron down with a guttural roar, but before it could connect, the deafening wail of sirens filled the alley. Red and blue lights flooded the narrow space, bouncing off the brick walls and illuminating Brad's terrified face. He stumbled back, dropping the weapon. It clattered loudly on the asphalt. He looked at me with wide eyes, realizing too late that he had walked into a meticulously laid trap. I watched as the officers swarmed him, pinning him to the hood of his luxury SUV. He screamed about his rights and his lawyers, but the handcuffs clicked shut with a satisfying finality. I did not stay to watch him be processed. I had what I needed. The dashcam footage was automatically uploaded to my secure cloud server the moment it was recorded. I drove straight to the courthouse, my hands steady on the wheel. I bypassed the line and went directly to the clerk's office. I presented the video evidence along with the audio recordings of the threats. The judge granted the emergency restraining order immediately. It was comprehensive. Brad, Rowena, and even Chloe were barred from coming within 500 feet of me or Maya. My phone started ringing the moment I walked out of the courthouse. It was Rowena. I let it go to voicemail, but I listened to it as I drove home. Her voice was shrill, hysterical. She was screaming at Dante, not me. She yelled that I was out of control, that I had set Brad up, that I was ruining the family name. She demanded that Dante fix this immediately, or she would cut him off completely. She said he was a weak man who could not control his own wife. When I pulled into my driveway, Dante's car was already there. He was waiting for me in the living room, pacing back and forth, wringing his hands. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single day. His eyes were bloodshot and his tie was undone. He rushed toward me as soon as I walked in. He started begging. He pleaded with me to drop the restraining order. He said Brad was just angry and did not mean it. He said Rowena was devastated. He said we could work this out as a family. I looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. He was still trying to protect the people who were actively destroying us. I walked past him into the kitchen and picked up a manila folder from the counter. I had prepared it last night. I walked back into the living room and threw it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy slap. Dante looked at the folder, then at me. He asked what it was. I told him to open it. He reached out with trembling fingers and lifted the cover. The first thing he saw was a high-resolution photo of him and Jasmine entering a hotel room, then another of them at a dinner table holding hands, then copies of the wire transfers from his personal account to hers. $50,000. Our savings. Dante's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the sofa, the photos scattering across the floor. He tried to speak, but only a strangled sob came out. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. He tried to say he was sorry. He tried to say it was a mistake. I cut him off. My voice was ice cold. I told him he did not have the right to speak to me. I told him he had forfeited his place in this house, and in my life, the moment he chose to betray me and finance it with our future. I told him to get out. It was just after midnight when the silence of the house was shattered by the roar of an engine. I was sitting in the dark living room watching the security monitors when high beams swept across the wall, blindingly bright. A black Mercedes SUV jumped the curb and tore across my front lawn, leaving deep gouges in the grass. It came to a halt, inches from the porch steps. The driver door flew open and Rowena Vance stepped out. She was not the composed matriarch in Chanel tonight. Her hair was wild, her eyes manic, and she was wielding a heavy metal garden hoe she must have grabbed from her own shed. She did not come to the door. She went straight for the flower beds. She began hacking at the replanted hydrangeas with a primal scream. She ripped the blooms from the earth, throwing dirt and petals against the siding of the house. She was screaming my name. She yelled that I was a parasite. She screamed that I had destroyed her son and humiliated her family. She shouted that she would tear my life apart brick by brick, just like I had done to her reputation. I did not go outside. I ran upstairs to Maya's room. She was wearing her noise-canceling headphones, fast asleep under her duvet, oblivious to the violence outside. But the bear on the shelf heard everything. The high-sensitivity microphone picked up every curse word, every thud of the metal hoe against the earth, and every threat Rowena screamed into the night air. Then came the sound of glass shattering. Rowena had picked up a decorative river rock from the garden border. She hurled it with surprising strength. It struck the siding just inches from Maya's window, cracking the vinyl but failing to break the glass. The sound was like a gunshot. Rowena screamed again. She yelled that I was hiding behind my locks like a coward. She yelled that she would take Maya and I would never see her again, even if she had to burn the house down to get her. I stood by the window looking down through the slats of the blinds. Rowena was panting, her chest heaving, standing amidst the ruined garden like a vengeful spirit. She looked unhinged. She looked dangerous. This was assault. This was destruction of property. This was a violation of the restraining order I had just filed. My hand was already on my phone. I dialed 911. My thumb hovered over the call button. I could have her arrested right now. I could have the police drag her away screaming in her designer dress. It would be satisfying. It would be immediate justice. But then I stopped. I looked at the phone screen. If I called the police now, they would arrest her for vandalism and trespassing. She would be out on bail in 2 hours. She would claim emotional distress. Brad would hire the best lawyers to spin it as a grandmother distraught over not seeing her grandchild. It would be a misdemeanor, a slap on the wrist. It was not enough. I needed more. I needed to cut off the head of the snake, not just bruise its tail. I needed them all in one room. I needed them to think they had won, so they would sign the papers that would seal their fate. I needed a total, unconditional surrender. I lowered the phone and ended the call. I watched Rowena get back into her car and reverse off the lawn, leaving tire tracks deep in the mud. I let her go, because when I took her down, I wanted it to be for life. I waited until 9 in the morning to make the call. I needed the sun to be fully up. I needed the normalcy of a Wednesday morning to contrast with the lie I was about to tell. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee. I dialed Rowena's number. My hand was steady, but my voice was ready to break. She answered on the second ring. She did not say hello, she just breathed into the phone waiting. I started to cry. It was a soft, defeated weeping. I told her she won. I said, Rowena, you were right. I am not strong enough. I cannot handle the pressure. I said, seeing you last night scared me. I realized I cannot protect Maya. I realized she is better off with you. I paused, letting her hear my jagged breathing. I said, I want to sign the papers. I want to give you full custody. There was a moment of silence on the other end, then a slow, satisfied exhale. Rowena's voice was like velvet over steel. She said finally, you are seeing reason, Ebony. It took you long enough to understand your place. She did not apologize for the vandalism. She did not ask if I was okay. She just accepted her victory as if it were inevitable. I told her I had the papers drawn up. I told her I was ready to sign everything over. I asked her to come to the house on Friday night at 7. I said I wanted to do it here where I felt safe. I said I wanted to say goodbye to Maya properly before I left. I made my voice sound small and broken. I said I was going to move back to my old neighborhood. I said I was going to disappear. Rowena chuckled. It was a dark, triumphant sound. She said, that sounds like a wonderful plan, dear. We will be there. Brad will bring the notary. We will make it official. Then her tone sharpened. She said, make sure Dante is there too. I want my son to witness this. I want him to see you give up. I want him to know that he belongs to us, not you. I promised her he would be there. I told her he was sleeping on the couch, but I would make him stay. She said, good. She said, do not try anything stupid, Ebony. We will be watching. I told her I had no fight left in me. I told her she had taken everything. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall. The performance was over. The trap was set. Rowena thought she was coming to a surrender. She thought she was coming to claim her prize. She did not know she was walking into a federal sting operation. She did not know that the papers I was preparing were not custody agreements, but confessions. I stood up and walked to the window. The garden was a wreck. The hydrangeas were torn and trampled. The siding was cracked. But it did not matter anymore. This house was just a stage now. And on Friday night, the curtain would fall on the Vance family forever. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. She wanted Dante to witness it. Oh, he would witness it all right. He would witness the end of his world. Thursday night bled into Friday morning, but I did not sleep. I had one final task to complete in the basement sanctuary. I sat before my encrypted laptop and initiated the secure file transfer protocol. The progress bar moved agonizingly slow as gigabytes of incriminating data were beamed directly to the secure servers of the FBI. I uploaded everything: the forensic accounting of the shell companies in the Cayman Islands, the audio files of Rowena conspiring to kidnap Maya, the video of Brad attacking me with a tire iron in the alley, the photos of Dante's infidelity, and the wire transfers to his mistress. It was a digital coffin for the Vance legacy. I typed a short message to Agent Miller. The package is delivered. The guests arrive at 7. Do not be late. He replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. Once the screen went dark, I went upstairs. The house was a disaster zone. I had let it rot for days to sell the narrative of my mental collapse. There were dishes in the sink and laundry on the sofa. But today I needed it to be pristine. I needed it to look like a museum. I scrubbed the floors on my hands and knees until the hardwood gleamed under the recessed lighting. I washed the windows until they were invisible. I wanted them to see their reflection in every surface. I wanted them to see the perfection of the home they tried to steal one last time before they were dragged out of it in chains. I went to the kitchen and began to prepare the refreshments. Rowena loved to play the aristocrat. She loved high tea and cucumber sandwiches. I sliced the crusts off the white bread with surgical precision. I arranged the pastries on a silver-tiered stand. I brewed a pot of expensive Earl Grey tea. I set the dining room table with my best china, the gold-rimmed plates, the crystal water glasses. It looked like a celebration. It looked like a surrender ceremony. It was actually a wake. At 6 o'clock, I went to the master bedroom. Dante was not there. He was hiding in the guest room, trying to drink away his guilt and fear. I locked the bathroom door and turned on the shower. I scrubbed away the grime of the last week. I washed away the smell of fear and the stain of their insults. I dried my hair until it was sleek and straight. I walked into the walk-in closet. I pushed aside the floral dresses and the sensible cardigans that Ebony the housewife wore. I reached to the very back. There was a garment bag that had not been opened in 7 years. I unzipped it. Inside was my black Armani power suit, the one I wore when I walked into boardrooms to tell CEOs they were going to prison. It fit like armor. I buttoned the jacket. I stepped into my 4-inch stilettos. The click of the heels on the floor sounded like a weapon being cocked. I stood at the vanity and picked up my lipstick. It was not a soft pink. It was a deep blood red. I applied it carefully, outlining my lips. I looked at myself in the mirror. The eyes staring back were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of the auditor. The housewife was dead. The predator had returned. At precisely 7 o'clock, the sound of heavy tires crunching on gravel announced their arrival. I stood in the foyer, my back straight, my hands clasped in front of me. I watched through the window as the caravan pulled up. Rowena's black Mercedes led the way, followed by Brad's Range Rover and a sleek silver sedan that I did not recognize. Dante emerged from the guest room, looking pale and unsteady, his eyes darting around the pristine house as if he did not recognize it. I ignored him. The front door swung open without a knock. They walked in like they already owned the place. Rowena was first wearing a triumphant smile and a suit that cost more than my car. Brad followed, exuding arrogance, his arm draped possessively over Chloe's shoulder. Behind them came a man in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase, the lawyer they had brought to seal my fate. And finally, Dante trailed in looking like a ghost haunting his own life. They stopped in the living room, taking in the scene, the tea service on the table, the spotless floors, and me. Rowena's eyes widened slightly when she saw my suit. She scanned me from head to toe, her lip curling in disdain, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. She expected a broken woman in sweatpants. She found a warrior in Armani. Brad broke the silence. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. He walked over to the table and picked up a cucumber sandwich, inspecting it with a sneer. He said, "Well, look at this. The maid cleaned up nice for her firing squad." He tossed the sandwich back onto the plate. He turned to me, his eyes cold and predatory. He said, "I assume you have come to your senses, Ebony. We do not have all night. We have reservations at Le Bernardin to celebrate." The lawyer stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the coffee table. He opened it and pulled out a thick stack of documents. He laid them out one by one. The custody transfer, the non-disclosure agreement, the relinquishment of all marital assets. He handed me a gold fountain pen. He did not look at me. He just pointed to the signature line. Rowena sat down on my white sofa, making a show of smoothing her skirt. She looked at Dante, who was hovering by the doorway. She snapped her fingers. She told him to come sit down and stop acting like a whipped dog. She said, "This is a happy occasion." She said, "We are finally getting rid of the problem." Dante shuffled over and sat on the edge of the chair, his head in his hands. Chloe walked around the room, touching things, picking up a vase and putting it down. She smirked at me. She said, "I hope you packed your bags, Ebony. I am turning this room into a yoga studio next week." She looked at Brad for approval, and he winked at her. Brad walked up to me. He loomed over me, trying to use his height to intimidate. He smelled of expensive cologne and rot. He leaned in close, his voice a low growl. He said finally, "You are being smart." He said, "You realized you cannot win against us." He said, "Sign the papers, Ebony. Sign them and get out of my sight. You are lucky we are letting you walk away at all. Sign it and disappear. I reached out and took the gold fountain pen from the lawyer's hand. The metal felt cold and heavy against my skin. I looked down at the documents. The legal jargon was dense, designed to strip me of everything. My home, my assets, my daughter, my dignity. It was a complete annihilation of my existence as a mother and a wife. I ran my thumb over the paper, feeling the texture. It was high-quality bond paper. Rowena spared no expense even on my execution warrant. I looked up slowly. My gaze swept across the room. Rowena was watching me with a predatory intensity, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Chloe was scrolling on her phone, bored already. Brad was checking his watch, impatient to get to his celebratory dinner. And then there was Dante, my husband, the father of my child, the man who had vowed to love and protect me. I walked over to him. I stood directly in front of him, blocking his view of his mother. He looked up, startled. His eyes were red-rimmed and fearful. He looked like a man who was already dead inside. I asked him quietly if he had anything to say. I asked him if this was really what he wanted. I asked him if he was going to let them destroy his family without a fight. Dante flinched. He looked at Brad, who glared back at him with a silent threat. He looked at Rowena, who tapped her foot impatiently. He looked back at me. His lip quivered. He whispered that he was sorry. He said he had no choice. He said they had him. He said he could not go to jail. He said, "Please, Ebony, just sign it and make it stop." I looked at him for a long moment. I saw the weakness that had always been there, hidden beneath his charm. I saw the cowardice that had allowed him to sell his soul for safety. I felt a final severing of the tie that bound us. The pity was gone. The love was gone. There was only clarity. He was not a victim. He was an accomplice. I walked back to the table. I sat down in the chair opposite the lawyer. I uncapped the pen. The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. They were holding their breath, waiting for the ink to hit the paper, waiting for their victory. I positioned the pen over the signature line. I pressed the nib to the paper. A small dot of black ink bled into the white fiber. Then I stopped. I lifted the pen. I placed it gently on the table next to the documents. I looked at my watch. The second hand swept past the 12. It was exactly 7:30. I looked up at Brad. I smiled. It was not a smile of surrender. It was a smile of absolute devastation. I said, "I am not signing anything." I said, "The time for signatures is over. It is time for judgment." The silence in the room was shattered by a sound so loud it felt like the house itself had been struck by lightning. Boom! 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 The heavy oak front door vibrated on its hinges. The crystal glasses on the table rattled against their saucers. Rowena jumped in her seat, clutching her chest. Chloe dropped her phone. Dante looked like he was about to vomit. Only Brad smiled. It was a wide, genuine grin that showed too many teeth. He checked his diamond-encrusted watch and laughed. He said, "Right on schedule." He looked at me with pity. He said, "Did you really think we would come here without insurance, Ebony?" He said, "We called the police on the way over." He said, "We reported an active domestic disturbance involving a mentally unstable woman and a child." He said, "Those are the good guys coming to take you away." He adjusted his cufflinks and smoothed his jacket. He walked toward the foyer with the swagger of a man who owns the world. He called out over his shoulder. He told me to say goodbye to this house because the next room I would see would have padded walls. He reached for the handle. He paused for a second to look back at me, enjoying the moment. He wanted to see fear. He wanted to see me beg. I just stared back at him and took a sip of my tea. Brad grabbed the handle and flung the door wide open. He put on his best concerned citizen face, ready to greet the local patrol officers he expected. He opened his mouth to spin his web of lies, but the words died in his throat. The night outside was not dark. It was blindingly bright. Floodlights cut through the darkness, illuminating Brad's silhouette like a target. A voice amplified by a megaphone boomed from the lawn. It did not say officer friendly. It said federal agents. Search warrant. Before Brad could process the words, a battering ram of armored bodies hit him. A dozen figures clad in full tactical gear poured through the doorway like a black tide. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. They did not ask questions. They did not pause for explanations. They hit Brad with the force of a freight train. He was thrown backwards, stumbling over his own expensive Italian loafers. He crashed onto the hardwood floor with a bone-jarring thud. A heavy boot planted itself squarely in the center of his back, driving the air from his lungs. His face was pressed against the floorboards I had just polished. Arms were wrenched behind his back, the zip ties cinched tight with a sharp zipping sound. Brad screamed. He yelled that this was a mistake. He shouted that he was Bradley Tucker and his father played golf with the mayor. He screamed that they were hurting him. A tactical officer leaned down his helmet visor, reflecting the room lights. He told Brad to remain silent. He told him he was under arrest for racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Brad stopped screaming. He looked up from the floor, his eyes finding mine across the room. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was the raw, naked terror of a man who just realized he was not the hunter. He was the prey. The room was a cacophony of shouting and the stomping of heavy boots. Rowena was backed into a corner near the fireplace. She was not in handcuffs yet, but she was surrounded by 3 agents with their weapons drawn. She was shrieking at the top of her lungs. She demanded to see a warrant. She demanded to call her lawyer. She screamed that this was a travesty of justice and that she personally knew the governor. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I was behind this. She called me a liar and a thief. She said I had staged this whole thing to extort money from them. Dante and Chloe were frozen in their seats. They looked like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming semi-truck. They were too terrified to move, too confused to speak. They just watched as their invincible mother was reduced to a hysterical mess by the federal government. Then the chaos seemed to part. Agent Miller walked through the front door. He did not look at Brad groaning on the floor. He did not look at Rowena screaming in the corner. He walked with a calm, steady purpose straight toward the dining table where I was sitting. He stopped 2 feet away and snapped his heels together. He looked at me with a deference that silenced the room. He spoke clearly, his voice cutting through the noise. "Good evening, Director. We have executed the warrant simultaneously at the office and the bank. The Cayman Islands authorities have cooperated. We have successfully frozen all assets, including the offshore trusts and the shell companies. The evidence you uploaded was flawless. We have them on everything from RICO statutes to wire fraud." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "Director." Rowena stopped screaming mid-sentence. Her mouth remained open, but no sound came out. She blinked rapidly, trying to process what she had just heard. Dante turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were wide with confusion and horror. He stammered. He asked what Miller just called me. He said Ebony is an accountant. She does tax returns. She is a housewife. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the lapels of my Armani suit. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the woman who clipped coupons and cooked dinner. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. I pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open. The gold badge inside caught the light gleaming with authority. I walked over to Dante. I held the badge up so he could read the engraving. I told him he was right about one thing. I am an accountant, but I do not work for a local firm. I told him I am the section chief of the Financial Crimes Division for the FBI. I told him I lead the Special Investigation Task Force dedicated to dismantling high-level money laundering operations. I looked at Rowena. Her face had gone ashen. I told her that I had been investigating the Vance family for 3 years before I even met Dante. I told her that marrying him was not an accident. It was an assignment. I told her that every insult she threw at me, every time she called me stupid or slow or low class, I was building a case against her. I told her that while she was playing checkers trying to steal my daughter, I was playing chess with her freedom. I told her that she did not just let a daughter-in-law into her house. She let in the wolf that was going to eat her whole. The room was deadly silent, save for the heavy breathing of the men in handcuffs and the low hum of the tactical radios. I turned my back on Dante and walked slowly over to the bookshelf in the corner. There it sat, the brown teddy bear with the soft fur and the plastic button eyes. It looked so innocent, so harmless. It was the gift Chloe had given Maya with a sneer, the Trojan horse they had planted in my home to destroy me. I picked it up. I felt the weight of it in my hands. It was heavier than a toy should be. I walked back to the dining table where the expensive tea service sat untouched. I picked up a sharp silver steak knife from the place setting. The agents watched me with stoic faces. The family watched me with dread. I looked at Rowena, who was trembling in the corner. I told her that she thought this bear was her ears. I told her she thought she was listening to the ramblings of a crazy woman. But she forgot one thing. In a surveillance war, the receiver is also a transmitter if you know how to wire it. I raised the knife and thrust it into the bear's stomach. I sliced the fabric open with a violent ripping sound that made Dante flinch. I reached inside the stuffing. My hand closed around the cold, hard plastic of the modified recording unit. I pulled it out. Wires dangled from it like guts. I held it up for them to see. I told them that this device did not just transmit to the library. It recorded locally. It had a backup drive that activated whenever it detected a voice in the room. And it picked up everything. Not just my staged breakdowns, but their conversations when they broke into my house. I pressed a button on the side of the device. A small green light flickered to life. I told Rowena that I found a particularly interesting file from 3 weeks ago. The night she came over drunk while I was at the grocery store. The night she thought she was alone in the nursery talking to herself. I pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. Rowena's voice filled the room, slurring slightly but unmistakable. She was laughing. She said those idiots never knew who lit the match. She said Ebony's parents were stubborn. She said they refused to sell that land for the new development. She said a little gasoline and a faulty wire was all it took. She said it was beautiful watching that old house burn with them inside. She said it solved all our problems. The recording stopped. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. Dante stared at his mother with a look of absolute horror. He had known she was a crook. He had known she was cruel. But he had not known she was a murderer. He had not known that the woman he married was the daughter of the people his mother had burned to death. Rowena stood frozen against the wall. Her face went from pale to a translucent gray. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. She looked at me and saw the truth. I was not just an agent doing a job. I was the avenging angel of the people she had killed for profit. The weight of the revelation was too much for her fragile reality to hold. Her eyes rolled back into her head, her knees gave out. She crumpled to the floor in a heap of Chanel fabric and gold jewelry out cold before she even hit the wood. Brad was not used to losing control. Even with his face pressed against the floorboards and plastic cuffs cutting into his wrists, he was still trying to negotiate. He twisted his neck to look at the tactical officer holding him down. He hissed that there was a safe in the guest house. He said there was $50,000 inside. He said it was yours if you just loosen these cuffs and let me make a phone call. He said everyone has a price and he was willing to pay double whatever the government was paying. The agent did not even blink. He just applied more pressure to the pressure point behind Brad's ear, making him yelp in pain. I walked over to where he lay. I stood directly above him, blocking out the harsh glare of the floodlights. I held a thick red folder in my hand. It contained the final nail in his coffin. Brad looked up at me. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. He tried to sneer, but it came out as a pathetic grimace. He said, "You are making a mistake, Ebony." He said, "My lawyers will tear this warrant apart." He said, "You are just an accountant. You do not understand how these things work." He said, "I will have your badge for this." I did not say a word. I just dropped the folder. It struck him square in the face. The papers spilled out, scattering across the floor around his head. They were shipping manifests, customs declarations, satellite photos of shipping containers in a port in Sudan. I knelt down so I was eye level with him. I kept my voice low and conversational as if I were explaining a tax error to a client. I told him that he was right about one thing. I am an accountant. And that is why I noticed that the shipping weights for his charitable shipments of textbooks and rice were off. I told him that paper and grain have a specific density. Lead and steel are much heavier. I picked up one of the photos and held it in front of his face. I told him that we intercepted the shipment in Khartoum yesterday morning. I told him we opened the crates labeled medical supplies. We did not find bandages or vaccines, Brad. We found automatic rifles and crate after crate of ammunition. Brad went still. The color drained from his face, leaving it the color of old ash. I told him that money laundering was a white-collar crime. He might have done 10 years in a minimum security facility for that. But arms trafficking is different. I told him that selling weapons to sanctioned warlords under the guise of humanitarian aid is a violation of international law. I told him he was not just looking at prison time. I told him he was looking at extradition. I told him he was going to be designated as an enemy combatant. I told him he would never see a golf course again. I told him he would die in a concrete box without a window. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. The arrogance evaporated instantly, leaving only a terrified child. He started to shake. A low keen of despair escaped his throat. He began to sob. It was a loud, ugly sound. He cried that he did not know. He cried that he was just the middleman. He begged me to help him. He screamed that he was family. I stood up and nodded to the agents. They hauled him to his feet. His legs were like jelly. He could not stand. They had to drag him across the floor, his expensive leather shoes scraping uselessly against the wood. He was wailing now, pleading for mercy, pleading for his mother who was already unconscious in the corner. I watched him go. I felt nothing but a cold, satisfied resolve. He was not a man anymore. He was just a case number closed. With Brad dragged away screaming and Rowena unconscious on the floor, the room felt suddenly spacious. The air was cleared of their suffocating arrogance, leaving only the cold, sterile reality of the law. All eyes turned to the last Vance standing. Chloe was frozen near the sofa, clutching her fake Hermes bag like a shield. But the sneer was gone. The posture of the bored socialite had vanished. She looked like a child caught playing dress-up in a burning building. She saw me looking at her. The weight of my gaze seemed to physically crush her. She dropped the bag. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling her lipsticks and credit cards across the hardwood. She took a step toward me, then another. Her knees seemed to turn to water. She sank to the floor in a heap of red silk. It was a pathetic display. She started to cry. These were not the fake tears she used to manipulate Dante or the bored sighs she used to dismiss me. These were real ugly tears of self-preservation. She clasped her hands together in a prayer motion. She crawled forward on her knees, her expensive stockings tearing on the floor. She begged. She said, "Ebony, please listen to me." She said I did not know about the guns. She said I did not know about the fire. She said I just did what Brad told me to do. She said he made me do it. She said I am your sister-in-law. We are family. She tried to reach for the hem of my pants. I took a sharp step back, moving my leg out of her reach as if she were contagious. I looked down at her with zero sympathy. I told her to stop talking. I told her that claiming ignorance is not a defense when you are spending dirty money. I told her that I traced every cent she spent on her secret credit card. I told her I knew about the gambling debts Brad paid off with funds meant for starving orphans in Sudan. I told her she was a beneficiary of blood money, and that made her just as guilty as the man who shipped the rifles. Chloe shook her head frantically, sending mascara running down her cheeks. She stammered that she could pay it back. She said she would testify against Brad. She said she would do anything. I crouched down so my face was inches from hers. I lowered my voice to a lethal whisper. I told her that the money was just numbers, Chloe. The money is federal time, but what you did to my daughter is personal. That is unforgivable. Her eyes widened in panic. She tried to deny it. She started to say she loved her niece. I cut her off. I pointed a manicured finger up at the corner of the ceiling toward the hidden camera lens gleaming in the recessed lighting. I told her that I saw exactly what she did last week. I told her I watched the footage of her pinching the tender skin of a 3-year-old child just to make her cry for a recording. I told her I saw the malice in her eyes and the joy she took in causing pain to an innocent baby. I told her that video file was not just on my server. I told her it was already in the inbox of the district attorney and the judge who signed the warrants. I told her that racketeering will get you a cell, but being a child abuser will make you the most hated person in the prison yard. I stood up and signaled to the agent behind her. He stepped forward and pulled her arms roughly behind her back. She did not fight. She went limp. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed in the silent room. It was the sound of a cage door closing forever. She was no longer a Vance. She was just another criminal in a red dress. The last of the tactical agents filed out the front door, taking the noise and the chaos with them. The silence that rushed back into the house was deafening. It was just the two of us now standing in the wreckage of the tea party that never happened. Dante stood in the center of the room, trembling like a leaf in a storm. He looked at the door where his mother and brother had been dragged out in chains, and then he looked down at his own wrists. They were bare. There was no cold steel biting into his skin. There were no zip ties cutting off his circulation. He looked up at me, and a slow wave of relief washed over his face. He misunderstood everything. He thought this was mercy. He thought this was love. He took a hesitant step toward me, his hands reaching out as if to embrace me. He let out a shaky breath that sounded like a laugh. He said, "Oh God, Ebony, you saved me. You protected me. I knew you would not let them take me." He wiped the sweat from his forehead. He said they were monsters, Ebony. I see that now. Thank you for getting them out of our lives. Now we can finally be happy. We can start over, just you and me and Maya. I took a step back, putting the dining table between us. I looked at him with a clinical detachment that felt colder than hate. I told him to stop. I told him he was confused. I said I did not save him because I loved him. I saved him because the evidence showed he was too incompetent to be a criminal mastermind. I told him I proved to the federal government that he was nothing more than a useful idiot, a signature on a page that he did not bother to read. I told him he was not going to prison because being a coward and a fool is not a federal crime. It is just pathetic. Dante froze. His smile faltered. He looked at me, searching for the wife who used to make him coffee and listen to his complaints about his mother. But she was gone. She had burned away in the fires of his betrayal. He started to stammer. He said, "But we are family, Ebony. We have a daughter. Everyone makes mistakes." He said he would make it up to me. He said he would get a job. He said he would be the husband I deserved. I reached down to the table. My hand hovered over the stack of documents the lawyer had brought. I pushed aside the custody transfer. I pushed aside the non-disclosure agreement. Underneath them all was a single crisp document I had placed there myself before the guests arrived. It was simple. It was final. I picked it up and held it out to him. I did not shove it. I did not throw it. I handed it to him with the steady hand of a professional closing a file. Dante took it. His eyes scanned the header. Petition for dissolution of marriage, sole custody, immediate eviction. The color drained from his face for the second time that night. He looked up at me, tears welling in his eyes. He whispered, "Ebony, please, do not do this. I have nothing left. They took the money. They took the company. If you take this, I have nothing." I walked to the door and opened it, holding it wide for him. The night air was cold and clean. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him that was the point. I told him he chose his side and now he had to live in the ruins of it. I pointed to the paper in his hand. I spoke the final words I would ever say to him as his wife. I said, "You wanted a signature, Dante. You wanted me to sign my life away. Well, here it is. This is the only thing I am signing today." Dante stood there clutching the divorce papers like a lifeline. He looked around the foyer as if seeing it for the first time. He looked at the coat rack where his cashmere scarf hung. He looked at the stairs leading up to the bedroom where he had slept for 7 years. He made a move to walk past me towards the living room, probably to pour himself a drink, or to find a place to sit and process the catastrophe. I stepped in his path. I did not shove him, but my presence was a solid stone wall. I told him he misunderstood. I told him he was leaving, right now. He blinked his eyes, darting back and forth in confusion. He stammered. He said, "But this is my house, Ebony." He said, "I have nowhere to go." He said, "Let me just stay in the guest room for a few nights until I sort out the bank accounts." He said, "I need to call the private banker and get some cash." I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. I looked at him with the clinical detachment of a coroner. I told him there is nothing to sort out, Dante. I told him to think about what just happened. I explained that in a federal RICO case, the government does not just arrest people, they seize assets. I told him that every bank account with his name on it had been frozen an hour ago. I told him the cars in the driveway were currently being impounded as proceeds of crime. I told him the credit cards in his wallet were just worthless pieces of plastic. He looked horrified. He asked about his trust fund. He asked about his personal savings. I reminded him of the $50,000 he had wired to Jasmine. I told him the feds view that as money laundering. I told him he is personally liable for the restitution. I told him that by the time the forensic accountants are done with him, he will owe the government more money than he could earn in 10 lifetimes. I told him he is not just broke, he is destitute. I told him that the house is in my name. I told him I bought it with my salary before we were married. I told him he has no claim to it. I pointed to the open door. I told him he was walking out of here with the clothes on his back and a debt he can never repay. I leaned in close. I told him good luck out there, Dante. I told him he was going to need it. I told him the real world is a cold, hard place when you do not have a mommy to clean up your messes or a wife to balance your books. I told him he was about to find out exactly how much a gallon of milk costs when you have to earn the dollar to buy it. Dante looked at me one last time. He searched my face for a shred of the woman who used to love him. He looked for the soft, forgiving wife he had betrayed. He found only the agent who had investigated him. He realized there was no mercy here. He stepped over the threshold. His Italian leather shoes hit the cold concrete of the porch. He looked at the empty driveway where his luxury sedan used to be. He looked at the dark street. He looked at the sky. He stood there shivering slightly in the night air. He realized the silence was absolute. There was no Rowena to scream orders. There was no Brad to promise a fix. There was no money to insulate him. He had traded everything for an illusion of power, and now he was left with nothing but the echo of his own bad choices. I watched his shoulders slump under the crushing weight of his total isolation. I did not say goodbye. I simply closed the heavy oak door. I threw the deadbolt. Click. It was the final sound of his old life ending. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was a cold, imposing building of stone and glass. It was a place designed to make you feel small. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the quiet murmur of anticipation. I sat in the very front row directly behind the prosecution table. I did not wear black today. I did not wear the gray of mourning or the navy blue of the bureau. I wore a suit of pristine white wool. It was bright. It was sharp. It was the color of a fresh start. It was the color of a blank page. I sat with my back straight and my hands folded in my lap. To my right sat Agent Miller and the rest of my task force. To my left, the gallery was packed with reporters and the victims of the Vance family fraud. But I only had eyes for the two figures sitting at the defense table. Rowena and Brad Vance did not look like the titans of industry they had pretended to be 3 months ago. They looked small. They looked gray. The orange jumpsuits of the Federal Detention Center hung loosely on their frames. Rowena's hair, which she used to dye and spray into a helmet of perfection, was now a limp curtain of white wisps. Her skin, without the layers of expensive creams and makeup, looked like crumpled parchment. Brad looked even worse. He had lost 30 pounds. His eyes darted around the room nervously like a trapped animal. The arrogance was gone. The swagger was gone. All that was left was the fear. The judge pounded his gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, demanding absolute silence. He began to read the sentencing. It was a long list: racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, arms trafficking, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He spoke about the severity of their crimes. He spoke about the lives they had ruined, the charities they had looted, and the weapons they had sold to warlords. He looked at them with undisguised contempt. He said that their greed knew no bounds, and their lack of remorse was chilling. Then came the numbers. For Bradley Tucker, the judge handed down 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Rowena Vance, due to her role as the architect of the enterprise and the confessed arsonist who murdered 2 people 30 years ago, he gave the same life. They would die in concrete boxes. They would never see the sky without a fence again. Brad slumped forward, his head hitting the table. He began to weep, a soft, pathetic sound that no one pitied. The bailiffs moved in to take them away. The chains around their waists and ankles rattled loudly in the hush of the courtroom. As they were hauled to their feet, Rowena turned. She looked across the wooden divider. She looked directly at me. Her eyes were wet and wide. For the first time in 7 years, there was no malice in them. There was no judgment. There was only a desperate, silent plea. She looked at the woman she had tormented, the woman she had tried to destroy, and she begged for a shred of mercy. She wanted me to look at her with recognition. She wanted acknowledgement. I looked at her. I saw the woman who had burned my parents alive. I saw the woman who had tried to steal my daughter. I saw a stranger. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out a pair of oversized black sunglasses. I slid them onto my face, covering my eyes completely. I erased her from my view. I stood up and turned my back on them. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, and I stepped out into the blinding sunlight of a free afternoon. The day the Vance estate went on the block, the sky was a brilliant, unyielding blue. It felt like nature itself was celebrating the purging of a rot. I stood at the back of the crowd on the manicured lawn. The yard was filled with curious neighbors, real estate sharks, and developers looking to tear the place down for condos. They whispered among themselves, pointing at the boarded-up windows and the overgrown hedges. They talked about the scandal. They talked about the FBI raid. They treated the house like it was cursed. The auctioneer stood on the front steps where Rowena used to look down on delivery drivers. He was a man with a booming voice and no sentimentality. He started the bidding low. The developers jumped in, driving the price up, but I waited. I stood silent and still in my sunglasses, watching the numbers climb. I had the settlement check from the government in my pocket, a reward for exposing a massive international arms ring. It was blood money in a way, but I was about to wash it clean. When the bidding stalled, I raised my paddle. I spoke a number that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. It was aggressive. It was final. The auctioneer paused, scanning the crowd for a counteroffer. There was none. He slammed his gavel down on the podium. Sold to number 42. I walked up the steps to claim my prize. The keys felt cold and heavy in my hand. I unlocked the massive front doors and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled different. The scent of Rowena's cloying perfume and Brad's stale cigar smoke was gone, replaced by the dry smell of dust and neglect. It was silent. The ghosts were gone, dragged away in chains. I walked through the empty rooms. I walked into the library where they had plotted to steal my daughter. I walked into the dining room where they had tried to force me to sign away my life, but I did not see the past. I saw the future. I walked into the ballroom. It was vast and empty. In my mind, I filled it with rows of small beds with colorful quilts. I saw the library filled not with fraudulent ledgers but with children's books and beanbag chairs. I saw the kitchen where Rowena had once scolded me for using the wrong fork filled with the smell of warm cookies and the sound of laughter. I was not going to live here. I was going to turn the Vance estate into the Phoenix home for children. I was going to take the house built on greed and murder and turn it into a sanctuary for orphans. It was the ultimate revenge. I was going to use their legacy to heal the very people they would have despised. I stopped in the center of the grand foyer. Hanging above the fireplace was the last remnant of their reign. It was a massive oil painting of Rowena commissioned 10 years ago. She was sitting on a throne-like chair wearing a ball gown, looking down at the viewer with that familiar sneer of superiority. Even in paint she looked cruel. I walked over to the fireplace. I reached up and pulled the heavy frame from the wall. It crashed to the floor with a satisfying splintering of wood. I dragged the canvas out of the frame, ripping it from the backing. I threw it into the empty hearth. I took a box of matches from my pocket. I struck one. The flame flared bright and hot. I dropped it onto the painted fabric. The oil paint caught fire instantly. The flames licked up the canvas, curling the edges. I watched as the fire consumed the hem of her dress. I watched it creep up to her hands, those hands that had hurt my child. And finally, I watched the fire engulf her face, melting the arrogance into a black, unrecognizable sludge. The smoke drifted up the chimney, carrying the last of the Vance name into the wind. I turned my back on the fire and walked out the front door, leaving the door wide open for the light to come in. The late afternoon sun poured through the kitchen window, bathing the room in a warm, golden light that felt like melted butter. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile halls of the courthouse and the shadowy corners of the Vance estate. Here in our small bungalow on the quiet side of town, the air smelled of vanilla frosting and strawberry jam. It was the smell of a home that had never known fear. I stood by the counter watching the scene before me with a heart that felt light and full. The kitchen was crowded not with socialites or lawyers, but with 6-year-olds wearing crooked paper hats. Mrs. Gable was there laughing as she helped wipe frosting off a cheek. My old partner, Agent Miller, was sitting on the floor awkwardly, trying to fit his long legs under the small craft table, while a toddler put stickers on his tie. It was Maya's 6th birthday. There were no diamonds. There were no press releases. There was just a lopsided homemade cake with pink sprinkles and the loud, chaotic joy of children being children. Maya sat at the head of the table. Her eyes were bright and clear. She threw her head back and laughed at a joke her friend told, and the sound was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of a childhood reclaimed. When the cake was gone and the sugar rush had settled into a content hum, it was time for presents. Maya sat on the rug, surrounded by colorful shreds of wrapping paper. She opened a box of crayons from her teacher and a puzzle from her friend. Then she looked up at me. Her eyes held a question. I walked over to the sofa and picked up the box I had hidden behind a cushion. It was wrapped in soft yellow paper. I sat down on the floor next to her and placed it in her lap. I told her this was a special one from Mommy. Maya tore the paper carefully. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in white tissue paper, was a bear. It was not brown like the old one. It was a soft, creamy white. It did not have hard plastic eyes that hid lenses. It had soft, embroidered eyes made of thread. It was squishy and huggable and completely, utterly ordinary. Maya reached in and lifted it out. She buried her face in its fur, taking a deep breath. She pulled back and looked at the bear, and then she looked at me. A small shadow passed over her face, a fleeting memory of a grandmother who broke things, and a bear that had wires in its tummy. She whispered to me. She asked if this bear had any secrets. She asked if it was listening to us. I reached out and brushed a stray curl from her forehead. I smiled, and it was a smile that reached all the way to my soul. I told her, no, baby. I told her this bear does not have any wires. It does not have any batteries. I told her it only has one secret inside of it. Maya tilted her head. She asked what the secret was. I pulled her into my arms, hugging her and the new bear tight against my chest. I whispered into her ear that the only secret is that Mommy loves you more than anything in the whole world, and that we are safe. Forever. Maya giggled. She squeezed the bear tight. She said she liked that secret. I looked out the window as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. I imagined looking at this house from the outside. I imagined the camera pulling back, slowly rising up above the trees. It would see a small house with lights glowing in the windows. It would see a yard with a swing set that was not broken. It would see a neighborhood where no one was watching and no one was plotting. It would see a mother and a daughter sitting on a rug holding a teddy bear surrounded by love. It was a perfect, ordinary ending to a terrible, extraordinary story. And it was exactly the life we had fought for. The most profound lesson from Ebony's saga is the devastating consequence of underestimating the quiet ones. The Vance family fell not because they lacked power, but because they were blinded by their own arrogance. They mistook Ebony's silence for submission and her patience for weakness. They failed to realize that while they were busy performing for the world, she was busy watching, documenting, and preparing. This story teaches us that true strength does not roar, it calculates. It reminds us that integrity is a long game. While lies and manipulation may offer a temporary advantage, the truth is an immovable object that eventually shatters everything built on deceit. Ebony proves that you do not need to lower yourself to your enemy's level to defeat them. You simply need to hold your ground and let the light of truth expose the darkness. Ultimately, it is a testament to the fact that a mother's love is the most formidable force on earth, capable of toppling empires to protect a child. In a world loud with posturing, never fear the silence. Fear what is being planned within it. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, do not forget to like and subscribe for more gripping tales of revenge and redemption.